Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I think I've admitted everyone. We'll have a few people coming in here in a few minutes. Welcome to the WVU CED Abilities Grand Rounds for May already, 2021. Can't believe it. So today we have Dr. Meyer, who's going to talk to us about poverty. And I know that many of you joining, we experience poverty with our families, and it impacts our services in many different ways. So um, we hope that his work connects with you in some way. And then at the end, kind of the format of this is the last few minutes we'll bring it back, and feel free to put in the chat or ask a question at that point in time before we close. So until then, just remember to mute your line and join us by video if you can. Otherwise, we're happy that you joined us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Mayer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cottrell. Um, so um, this work that I'm going to talk about is joint with Derek Wu, who's a PhD student at the University of Chicago, and Brian Curran, who's a pre-doc who's going to start in a PhD program at Chicago in September. The views that I'm going to express are not necessarily those of the US Census Bureau, and all of the results that I'm going to describe have been approved for release by the Census Bureau's Disclosure Review Board. And I'd welcome suggestions. An economist used to being interrupted. That's actually our style of seminar presentation. So even though it's, I guess, against the local rules, I am happy to have you interrupt me with questions or comments. What I'm going to talk about is a very specific research question that I think has larger implications, especially for West Virginia or rural areas that have low housing costs. As you'll see, it's low housing costs that are key here. So the question that I'm going to look at is, should one geographically adjust the cutoffs for determining whether or not a family is in poverty? And should one target for higher benefits those areas essentially with high housing costs? And that will have a lot of implications for poverty in rural areas and for West Virginia and other low housing cost areas. So the starting point for our project is the observation that prices differ across geography. In particular, the cost of a two-bedroom apartment is a lot higher in New York City than it is in rural West Virginia. The question that arises is, should we adjust for these prices in defining the cutoffs for whether or not someone is poor? And should we change the eligibility for government benefits to make them possibly lower income required in places where costs are low, like in West Virginia, and let people be eligible for benefits even if they have much higher income in a high cost place like San Francisco or New York City? There have been bills in Congress proposed recently to do just that, to say that poverty essentially is less of a problem in West Virginia than currently recognized, and more of a problem in New York City and San Francisco than currently recognized by our official measures. And there's also a active political debate about what geographic areas are most in need of government support. This debate is a little bit different. Rather than taking money away from West Virginia, which is what is generally proposed in that first line of argument and in the first set of discussions that would geographically adjust poverty thresholds. This other political discussion is about whether we should support geographic areas that have had population declines and have had bad economic conditions for a while. There are Biden administration proposals to support places like Huntington, West Virginia. There was a nice piece in the New York Times just 2 days ago discussing these proposals. And the mayor of Huntington, West Virginia was interviewed, and there was a lot of discussion about that city as an example of places that might merit additional government support. The policy implications of geographically adjusting our definition of poverty is the implications are really quite substantial. They would say that fewer people are poor in low housing cost, rural areas, and they would say that poverty is higher than we conventionally say it is in mostly coastal big cities. Our official poverty measure that I'll sometimes just call the OPM does not have an adjustment for geography. So the poverty cutoff is about $25,000 for a family of 4 anywhere in the country. And the poverty measure, the official one, is not only used to determine eligibility for government programs, but it's also used to allocate hundreds of billions of dollars of federal funds, and it guides policies as well. The Census Bureau has considered adjusting poverty thresholds and poverty measures for geographic prices. The supplemental poverty measure, or SPM, which is a measure that the Census Bureau produces, and I will say it's probably among researchers the most preferred measure of poverty, though I am not among its fans for various reasons. But a majority of poverty researchers across the country would argue that it's a better measure than our official measure. And this measure does have adjustments for local prices in the cutoffs that it uses. There is, I think, probably a prevailing wisdom, more than a majority of economists would, without investigating the issue deeply, if asked, should you adjust poverty thresholds for local housing costs, they'd probably say yes. But there's also, and that's just because it costs more to buy a typical house or rent a typical apartment in New York City than it does in rural Mississippi. And that's fairly intuitive, but there's also a standard theory that says that adjusting poverty cutoffs for geographic differences in prices could be counterproductive. And that's because differences in housing costs across areas reflect characteristics of those areas. And housing prices might be higher in one area because the schools are better, there's better health care, better other public benefits, wages may be higher. So the way that's summarized in the economics literature is that housing costs and other local prices reflect amenities of the area. So they reflect the supply and demand of housing and the desirability of different geographic areas. Now, what that suggests in strict economic theoretical terms is that you shouldn't just account for prices in an area when deciding on what poverty cutoffs should be. You should also account for the amenities. We know that when housing prices are higher, that's often associated with local schools being better, environmental conditions being better, wages being higher. We also know that the generosity of many welfare and social insurance programs is higher, the level of benefits is higher in areas with higher housing prices. Now, it's not simple to figure out how you would adjust prices for local amenities. And in fact, the economics literature says it's a little mixed, but I think the most convincing work says you probably shouldn't try and do it because it's just too hard, that we don't have the data or the methods to really do that. But that's one approach one could take. So what I'm going to talk about in this research is that we're going to assess the desirability of adjusting poverty thresholds across geography by whether or not, when you do it, it gives you a definition of who's poor that says that the people who are poor are the most deprived. So we're going to look at whether when you geographically adjust poverty cutoffs, you get a more deprived population that you call poor. That's the mechanical thing that I'm going to look at, but it has larger implications for thinking about well-being across geography. So let me talk about that for a minute, because that's probably what will excite you the most. So we're going to essentially have to look at whether the level of well-being measured by 9 domains of well-being, and I'll go through them in a minute, whether, and these things include health and disability and characteristics of your house, whether you have cracks in the walls and peeling paint and pests, whether you can pay your bills, your food security, the your income long-term, mortality, and I've missed a few of the measures of well-being, but I'll go through them all in a more orderly fashion in a minute. So we're going to show you, or I'm going to show you how those measures of well-being differ across geography. And that's probably among the most interesting aspects of this, but I'm going to do it with a particular set of policies in mind, whether you should raise the eligibility for raise the eligibility cutoff, which would make more people eligible in New York City, and lower the cutoff level, which would make fewer people eligible in West Virginia, which is what I think probably a majority of people in my profession would argue one should do, but I hope that they will change their mind after seeing this new evidence, which is unlike any evidence that's been brought to bear on this question so far. So let me summarize the results, and then I'll take you through how we got there. So what this paper does is it compares 9 categories of material well-being among those who would be added to the poverty rolls and removed from the poverty rolls by a geographic adjustment. People would be added in New York and removed in West Virginia. And what we are going to do is essentially compare those two groups of people. And it's the 7th project to come out of a larger project that we call the Comprehensive Income Dataset, or CED project. And this project, the CED, links most of the major Census Bureau surveys to IRS tax records and program data from many federal agencies and states, including Social Security Disability Insurance and SSI. The key result that we find is that if you incorporate a geographic adjustment, it consistently leads you to identify a group that you're going to call poor that's less deprived than if you don't do a geographic adjustment. Thus, we take it to pretty strongly say that you don't want to adjust poverty cutoffs for geographic differences in prices. So let me tell you what data we're going to use. We use 2 surveys: the current population survey, which is the source of official income and poverty statistics. And then we use another survey called the Survey of Income and Program Participation, or SIP, that is the government survey that has the most comprehensive income information, but it's kind of a clumsy survey, hard to use, and it was started in 1984, so it doesn't go back as far as the current population survey, or CPS. So it's not used as much. And we're going to use information from both of these surveys that pertain to 2010, the year 2010. Besides these survey data, we're going to have, for these same individuals, earnings, asset income, and retirement income from tax records, Social Security, benefits, both retirement and disability, SSI benefits, veterans disability benefits, taxes, housing assistance from HUD, and information on mortality from a data set called the Numident. We are going to link these all together using protected identification keys that are attached to each of the data sets. You can think of these protected identification keys, or PICs, as transformed Social Security numbers. So then we're going to construct poverty measures, and our resource measure, what you compare to the cutoffs, is in one case going to be pre-tax money income plus in-kind transfers like SNAP, and housing benefits minus expenses and taxes. And we're going to compare that to a cutoff that is adjusted for housing costs. So essentially, you take the median rent index, which is an index of rents in a geographic area, and you multiply it by the share of spending that goes to housing. And then you use that to adjust the poverty cutoffs. So that's one measure of poverty, and that's what I'll call the supplemental poverty measure. And it's the current, it's not the official measure, but it's the one that researchers tend to prefer. And then I'm also going to use a new poverty measure that we've developed that relies on better data than anyone has ever had, because it combines administrative data from tax records and program records with survey data. That's an important thing to do because it turns out people don't report their income well on surveys. About half of food stamps and half of cash welfare just isn't reported. And you can imagine that there's some stigma involved in reporting receipt of those benefits, but that's not really what we think is leading people to not report those money. It's that income is just kind of a sensitive topic and people don't like to talk about it, and both the respondent and interviewer rush through those sections of the surveys. A suggestion of that being the story is that half of retirement income just doesn't get reported either. So stigma or discomfort in reporting that shouldn't be an issue with retirement income. So the second poverty measure is going to use the same geographically adjusted thresholds that I mentioned for the supplemental poverty measure, but we'll use a measure of income that incorporates these administrative records from taxes, tax system, from the IRS, and from government programs. And we'll also account for return on assets people have. So if you own a house outright, you don't need to pay rent. And so we consider that to provide a flow of resources akin to income. And we include in-kind transfers and subtract taxes. So I should also mention that we compare these geographically adjusted measures of poverty to ones that don't account for geographic differences. So let me show you a couple pictures. This here we just show you what the cutoffs are for our different poverty measures. When we geographically adjust or not, we keep the overall cutoffs on average the same. So you can see that these two sets of bars are almost the same for our different poverty measures, which are indicated by SPM or CIPM. SPM is the Census Bureau's current preferred measure, and the CIPM is our new measure. We have to raise the cutoffs when we go to the comprehensive income poverty measure, the one that uses administrative data, because when you use the administrative data, you catch a lot more income that doesn't get reported in the surveys. And we want to keep the same share of people defined as poor, no matter what measure we're using, so that we're essentially comparing people who are similar, no matter what measure we use, or the same share of the population. Because if one measure defined a smaller share of people as poor, it could be more selective than it would necessarily generate a more deprived group that's called poor. And we want to look at how different ways of defining the population that's poor, holding the share fixed, affects how deprived is the group of people that you're calling poor. So we have to use much higher cutoffs when we use the measures that incorporate administrative data, because the survey data alone underreports income so much. So let me now show you some pictures that hopefully will hammer home what are the key policy issues. So what this figure shows is how poverty would change if you went to adjusting the poverty cutoffs by geography. The darker colors mean that you would say poverty is higher. So this figure uses the data from the supplemental poverty measure and uses the adjustment for housing costs as they vary across geography that's used in the Census Bureau's preferred poverty measure. But as I said earlier, this is not incorporated in the official measure, just the one that Census Bureau researchers prefer. And what you should see is that this new measure that the Census Bureau publishes every year would make poverty go up dramatically in California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, Delaware, up in New York, but not as much as in some of the other geographic areas. And it would say that poverty is actually much less of a problem in West Virginia, Kentucky, Mississippi, Arkansas, the Dakotas, and Iowa than it's currently recorded as being in official data. And I should emphasize this is using 2010 data because currently that's our best data to look at this question. You can also look at how poverty would change at a finer geography. And so let me show you that. And here you can see quite clearly that this new poverty measure, and this is characteristic of any of the ones that's been proposed that geographically adjusts for prices, would say that poverty is much higher on the coasts in big cities and lower in rural areas. So the lighter shaded areas are the South and rural areas and the Plains states mostly. And you can see that poverty would be characterized as falling by 25% in Morgantown and in almost all of West Virginia. It would fall sharply, but not quite as much in the counties around Charleston. What else would adjusting poverty cutoffs and maybe consequently benefits for programs like SSI and SSDI mean in terms of who would be eligible? Well, in terms of demographics, and here non-geographically adjusted is in blue, and kind of a maroon, a maroonish pink is geographically adjusted. It says that the share of the poverty rate for those who are rural would go down a lot if you geographically adjusted. That's the most obvious thing here. Race and Hispanic origin doesn't change a lot, though the share that's Hispanic would go up, or the poverty rate for those who are Hispanic would go up a bit because they're more likely to be located. Hispanic individuals are more likely to be located on the coasts. There is a big increase for those who are Asian, again, likely because of the concentration of Asians on the coasts. But other differences are not as stark. So let me describe now how we evaluate whether or not geographic adjustments are a good idea. And in doing so, we will describe how well-being differs across geography. So in both of our data sets, the CPS and the SIP, we can look at 3 measures of well-being. In the SIP that I'm going to talk about, one of the data sets, we can look at 6 additional measures of well-being. But in both data sets, we can look at what we call permanent income or long-term income. And it's taking tax records and it's summing income over the 2 years before 2010 and the 2 years after. And we use income on IRS 1040s. If those aren't available for a person, we use W-2s and 1099-Rs. We also look at mortality up to 9 years later, and we look at years of education, since that's a good indicator of many, a good indicator of well-being. We also look at health problems, whether someone is in fair or poor health, whether they have a health condition that limits work or a health condition that prevents work. So we have 4 indicator variables here, because we look at health of the head and then whether any individual in the family has fair or poor health. We look at inability to pay bills. Those are the material hardship measures, and whether phone was disconnected, whether you couldn't see a doctor or a dentist, home quality problems like a leaking roof, whether you have basic appliances. We look at people's assets, and we look at food security, whether people have enough food to eat. We use statistical method called regression in most of the calculations here. And what the approach does is it tells you how those who are poor when you do a geographic adjustment compares to those who are poor if you don't do a geographic adjustment. And the way we do it is we divide up the population into 4 mutually exclusive groups: those who are always poor, no matter how you define poverty; those who are never poor, no matter how you define poverty. And then the 2 key groups are what we call the switchers: those who are only poor when you do a geographic adjustment, and those who are only poor when you don't. And we compare those 2 groups since they're the only 2 that really matter for a comparison of whether or not doing a geographic adjustment makes sense. On the next slide here, we show how many people, or what share of people, switch their definition of poverty depending on what data set you use, the CPS or the SIP, or whether you measure income using the supplemental poverty measure, the census's preferred measure, or you use this new measure, which we think is much better, that accounts for underreporting of income in surveys. And you can see that about 1.5% of people move from being poor to not poor, or the reverse, when you account for geographic differences in prices. So what are our main results? Well, when you geographically adjust, I've argued that you should see, if geographically adjusting makes sense, that the people that you're now calling poor are worse off than before you did the geographic adjustment. And that would be indicated by a plus sign in column 5 here. We look at different outcomes like the long-term or permanent income of people, their education, mortality, health, disability status. And we find that, I don't report disability status, but I can tell you what we do find. We looked at 56 outcomes, and I've just, this was our standard table that just reports about a dozen of them that are more central. And what you see here is that all of the differences between those who are poor with and without a geographic adjustment that are significantly different from zero, where there's strong evidence, they say that doing a geographic adjustment gives you a less deprived population. So one that really is a less good definition of poverty, we would argue. There's only one indicator here that goes in the direction that you would hope it would if geographically adjusting thresholds made sense, and it's insignificant. So there's only one plus sign, and it's for an insignificant coefficient in column 5. What this says is that in rural Mississippi or in West Virginia, and we don't have the data to specifically look in rural Mississippi or West Virginia, I should say, given the national data, and we want significant coefficients, but to precisely estimated coefficients, but in the areas where a geographic adjustment would reduce poverty, it turns out people are worse off. They have lower income, lower education, higher mortality, more health problems, lower assets, and more food insecurity. So I basically talked about the coefficients in column 1, but changed the sign to talk about how people are in those areas where you would reduce the poverty rate rather than areas where you would increase the poverty rate under a geographic adjustment. Here's another way of summarizing the evidence. This shows you the numbers of the 56 different measures of well-being that tend to not favor on the left side or favor on the right side a geographic adjustment. And the estimates that are significant are indicated in blue. Those that aren't significant are indicated in pink. And here, the vast majority of the indicators suggest that you don't want to adjust poverty thresholds for geography. And the vast majority of those that are significant go in the same direction. So another way of interpreting these results is that if you think about looking at families with the same nominal income, say $20,000 or $30,000 in Mississippi compared to New York, those in Mississippi look like they're worse off in many indicators. And the suggestion is that's also the case in West Virginia. So, though I should be clear, we're grouping together here to look at this all low housing cost areas, essentially, and comparing them to all high housing cost areas. Okay. So let me skip ahead to the conclusions. We do a lot of robustness checks to try different ways of measuring prices. We look at different cutoffs. So half the poverty line and 1.5 times the poverty line, and you see the same pattern. You might ask, what is behind some of these patterns? Well, just to get an idea what could be going on, and this is not definitive and is not a causal analysis, we find that when wages go up in an area, on average, when housing prices go up by 1% in an area, wages on average go up about 1%. And this is an analysis at the core-based statistical area, which is essentially a cluster of counties. It's the level of geography that census uses for geographic price adjustments. And when housing prices are 1% higher in an area, disability income per capita is 2%, more than 2% lower. So what that says is that in places like rural West Virginia, disability income receipt rates are high. Also, SSI per capita is high. Again, to think about the situation of West Virginia, you'd want to reverse the signs on all these coefficients. SNAP benefits per capita are higher in places like West Virginia. Housing benefits are lower, and retirement income is lower. In this analysis here, we had to do at the state level because the data were not available at the finer level of geography. But in places where housing costs are lower, like West Virginia, on average, spending on welfare, spending on K-12 education is lower. Environmental and housing spending is lower. Spending on most other state and local public goods is lower. So let me conclude, because I think I've already gone past my time, and take questions. So we find that those classified as poor, when you account for geographic differences in prices, appear to be less deprived than those classified as poor without a geographic adjustment. And the results are strikingly consistent across different domains of well-being. And we try a lot of other robustness approaches like different price index. We try partially adjusting for prices, and we see the same pattern. So these results say that you wouldn't want to geographically adjust if you want to have the most poor people defined, or most deprived people defined as poor. So let me stop there. I've talked too long. Let me take questions.
No, this is really interesting. I'm sorry you felt like you needed to stop. ramping up, and it was nice to tell the story of your studies over time. People, if you people want to put comments in the chat, or does anyone have a question that they want to ask?
Let me try and provoke a question.
Okay.
People don't have questions. So it's been proposed that this kind of argument that suggests that we should adjust poverty cutoffs for local prices should also mean that we should have lower SSI and DI benefits in low cost areas. It's kind of the logical extension of this argument that I'm trying to say, not so fast. That doesn't make as much sense as you thought it might.
Mhm.
So
I would say yes. My question off of that is how much research or how much exploration is being done into what is quickly turning into a world economy. We buy things off of the internet. We don't necessarily buy things locally. To what extent are prices flattening out over the country and not necessarily geographically important? My other question is, I know that there were just a few of the pieces of the index that the measurements were used on. And I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly, but where does culture come in? What protective factors can be pulled out based on the geographic region or the culture within that geographic region or the various different cultures? Is that something that we can find out?
oh boy. Okay, so let me start with the first question on the internationalization of the economy.
Right.
So the price index that I mostly talked about, that we used in our base analysis, only looks at differences across geography and housing.
Right.
Because it's not traded. It's not internationally traded. And we did do analysis using a second set of price indices that accounts for, oh boy, I should know how many different kinds of goods. It accounts for non-housing, prices of non-housing goods as well. But most of the variation across geography is in housing costs. So, it's not just that prices are internationalized; they're nationalized too. So so basically we account for it, and most of the story is housing anyway. So in terms of culture, so we don't, in comparing geographic areas, we don't account for any particular aspects of the culture of different areas. We have redone our analysis where you control for region, where you control for whether someone lives in a rural or non-rural area, and you see the same basic patterns. So it's not a south versus north difference or an urban rural difference, though the urban rural difference does underlie a lot of the results that I showed you. They're still there if you remove it.
Mhm.
just not as strong. Um, uh, so I don't know if that gets at what you meant by culture, but
To an extent, yeah. And I think it's kind of a tricky question because so much can be considered culture. You can kind of throw anything into that question. But what comes to mind is something like types of households, because one of the measures on there is that the multiple households, not just single parent, but when you apply the geographic um, formula, their poverty goes up. And that's interesting. It's very slightly, but are you talking about people with multiple incomes in a household or just people with multiple people within the household rather than a single income person? So that could be an aspect of culture. Is there a protective factor with people who are more likely to live in a single household regardless of its cost?
so you're thinking of, I'm trying to get to one. Oh, I probably have already gone
I
past
think you
it.
passed it. No,
No, where is that? There we go.
there.
So you're,
Does multiple parents mean multiple incomes? Or is it just multiple parents? Because those are two different things and both
it
can have
means
cultural
multiple
implications.
parents. It's the opposite of single parent. So
Okay.
so it's really two parent families. So when you geographically adjust, poverty is a little bit higher among two parent families and lower among single parent families. The
That's
differences
interesting.
are big. And it's mostly where those people are, those different types of families are located.
Mhm.
On the coasts versus south and plains and rural areas.
Mhm.
Okay.
So I had a question that may not be a good topic to interject because I know we're talking about macroeconomics here, but in trying to apply this to um, daily life, I know that we have fee for service, and that fee for service only accounts for poverty level. Would the translation of this model be applicable to that micro level where we should potentially look at something in addition to poverty level or the level of income, I should say? What's the level of income coming into the house? Should there be a geographic or some other factor put into that fee for service model that's more accurate?
Yeah, so this doesn't really tell you so much what you should do at the local level. It's really, as you said, it's about whether resources should be reallocated to New York City and California from West Virginia.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And though the approach says that, that you could look at many indicators of well-being besides someone's income to get a better fix, to get a better measure of how well off they are.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the underlying approach here. And we show how you could, for families, assemble all kinds of indicators from health and mortality and education to long-term income to inability to pay bills and assets and problems with their home and whether they have a computer and a dishwasher. And one of the reasons we wrote this paper is to think about assembling all those data to get a more holistic view of who's deprived. And one of the things we're now headed to do is look at on these indicators, how do poor disabled individuals compared to people who are poor because they're aged or they're a single parent with 3 kids and can't work. So we think of this as getting a more comprehensive and more tangible view of what it means to be poor. Just saying that someone in a survey had income recorded as less than $20,000. It's often error prone. It's often measured with error. And 2, it's a little less tangible in terms of what it means in someone's daily life.
Right. It's an interesting model, though, and it would be interesting to see if it's applicable at that level in many instances. It's really interesting. So it's past 3. We've really appreciated your presentation, and there's a question in here about whether are you comfortable if we share slides with attendees?
Sure.
So we'll get those out, and I can also.
I'll send you a new copy.
Okay, that would be great.
I edited them a bit from the ones that I sent you a week or so ago.
Okay, that would be perfect. I appreciate you doing that. And thanks to everyone for joining us this hour. Again, very, very interesting topic, and I'd really like to bring you back and see more about what you get into in the next few studies. It's something, again, that's very pertinent to us and we face every day. So thank you.
Well, my pleasure. And if people have questions, don't hesitate to email me.
Okay, we'll do. I'll collect and I'll send out your contact information to people too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too.